The year is 1982. Somewhere in the Rostov Oblast, a train is moving south. In one of its carriages, in a window seat, a man in a gray coat is watching the landscape. Flat land, lines of trees alongside the tracks, the occasional cluster of buildings that marks a town, and then the flat land again. He is carrying a briefcase. He has nowhere to be until Monday. He is looking at the platforms as the train slows through each station. He is looking at who is waiting, who is alone, who looks like they need something. He has time. Viktor Burakov was 34 years old in 1982. He was a forensic analyst with the Rostov Criminal Investigation Department. Not yet the lead investigator on the case that would consume the next 8 years of his life, but already one of the officers who had noticed the pattern. The bodies appearing in the forest strips alongside the railway lines. The mutilation that suggested something far outside the range of ordinary violent crime. The geographic spread that implied a perpetrator who was not local to any single district. He had been filing reports, requesting resources, using the careful, bureaucratic language of a Soviet law enforcement officer who understood that saying the wrong thing too loudly could end a career faster than failing to solve a case. What he was trying to say in that careful language was this: there is a single individual committing these murders. He is traveling. He is not known to his victims. He targets people who are isolated and transient. He is not a mentally disabled teenager or a member of a satanic cult. He is an adult man with access to the transit system, which means he is a working Soviet citizen with a legitimate reason to be on these platforms. And that is precisely why nobody has noticed him. His superiors heard the reports. They filed them. They continued operating on the theories they had already committed to. The cult, the gang, the local deviant, because those theories had the advantage of being simpler, and because simplicity, in a Soviet bureaucracy under pressure, was its own kind of value. Burakov filed another report. He understood something that the system he worked inside was structurally unable to acknowledge: that the killer was ordinary, that his ordinariness was not a disguise he had constructed. It was simply what he was, most of the time, in most contexts, to most people. The monster existed in specific circumstances, for specific durations, and then it went away and left behind a man with a briefcase and a commuter pass, and nothing that looked like evidence from the outside. This was the problem. Not the lack of resources, not the incompetence of individual officers. The problem was that the system had no framework for thinking about a person like this. While Burakov was filing reports, the killing continued. In June of 1982, a 13-year-old girl named Viktor Burakov was walking home from a shopping errand in the village of Donskoy. She was a student. She knew the road. She had walked it before. Chikatilo encountered her on that road. He dragged her into the undergrowth beside it. Her body was found in the vegetation nearby. The pathologist counted 22 stab wounds. The orbital area around both eyes had been subjected to sustained, deliberate attack. The first clear emergence of the pattern of eye mutilation that would become one of his defining signatures. Viktor Burakov was 13 years old. She had been running an errand. In August of that same year, in the Adygea region, a 9-year-old boy named Oleg Pozhidayev disappeared during one of Chikatilo's business trips. His body was never recovered. He is a name in a file, a confession detail, a coordinate on a map, because the forest kept him. In September, a 15-year-old boarding school runaway named Sergei Kuzmin was lured from a railway station in Shakhty. His body was found the following January. In December, a 10-year-old girl named Olga Stelmachenok was lured off a bus she was taking home from piano lessons in Novoshakhtinsk. She was found 2 months later in a snow-covered field. She had been carrying sheet music. The sheet music was still in her bag when they found her. These are 4 victims from 1 year. The investigation in 1982 was not treating them as 4 victims from 1 killer. It was treating them as 4 separate cases, handled by 4 separate local militia departments across 4 separate jurisdictions, none of which were systematically sharing information with each other, because the Soviet law enforcement structure did not require them to, and because the ideological framework governing the entire system still insisted that what they were looking at could not be what it was. Serial murder was a capitalist disease. That was not a metaphor or a casual observation. It was the official theoretical position of Soviet criminology, derived from Marxist-Leninist doctrine, that the psychological conditions producing serial predators were products of bourgeois capitalism, of alienation, of inequality, of the corrupting influence of a society built on exploitation. In a socialist state, the material conditions that created such pathology did not exist. Therefore, serial murder, as a category, could not exist. This position was taught in the academies. It was embedded in the procedural frameworks that governed how cases were classified and investigated. It meant that an investigator like Burakov, who had a map covered in red markers and a strong, evidence-based suspicion that a single individual was responsible, could not officially report what he believed, because what he believed was, by definition, ideologically impossible. He could report multiple unrelated homicides with similar characteristics. He could not report a serial killer. The distinction was not semantic. It was the difference between deploying the resources of an entire investigation apparatus toward a single, defined target, and deploying those same resources toward a diffuse, disconnected collection of individual cases that had no official relationship to each other. The killer moved between those individual cases like a man walking through doors that were not supposed to be open. In 1983, the murders moved into the city. Aviators Park in Rostov-on-Don was a public green space, the kind of urban park that Soviet city planning produced in quantity, broad and functional, with paths through stands of trees and benches at intervals, and the general assumption of safety that comes from a place being used by ordinary families on ordinary afternoons. Chikatilo used it as a hunting ground from 1983 onward. On August 9, 1983, a 7-year-old boy named Igor Gudkov was playing near the park's edge when he wandered in. Igor was the youngest of Chikatilo's confirmed victims. He was the age at which children still trust adults completely and automatically, not from naivety, but from the still intact understanding that adults are there to help, that a grown man who speaks to you in a park has no reason to do anything other than help. His body was found in the undergrowth, severely mutilated. Several organs had been removed. Igor Gudkov was 7 years old. When Viktor Burakov stood over the evidence in this case, he made a decision that shifted the trajectory of the investigation. The previous assumption had been that the female victims and the male victims were separate crimes, that the killer of young women and the killer of young boys were different people with different motives, requiring separate investigations. Burakov looked at the evidence and refused that assumption. The mutilation patterns were too consistent. The geography was too consistent. The method of approach, the platform, the offer, the tree line was too consistent. One person, one investigation. It was the right conclusion. It was also the conclusion that officially transformed the case from a collection of individual homicides into something the Soviet system still did not have a word for. The investigation's response to the mounting body count was not nothing. It was worse than nothing. It was misdirected effort deployed at scale, causing damage to innocent people while the actual target remained untouched. The Rostov militia, working from the theoretical assumption that sexually motivated violence against children was associated with deviance, and that deviance in a Soviet context was most visible in homosexual men and the mentally disabled, conducted a systematic campaign of surveillance, harassment, and detention targeting both communities. Gay men in Rostov were rounded up, interrogated, their networks mapped, their movements monitored. None of this was legal, even under Soviet law. The methods used were extrajudicial, operating in the gray zone between official procedure and the kind of pressure that law enforcement exercised when it needed answers and did not want to be slowed down by procedural constraints. Men were brought in for questioning and subjected to the same interrogation techniques that had produced Kravchenko's false confession. Some of them signed statements. Some of those statements were used to build cases that went nowhere because the people they described had nothing to do with the murders, and the evidence, such as it was, could not survive contact with even the minimal scrutiny of a Soviet court. Meanwhile, the militia compiled lists of mentally disabled individuals in the Rostov area, cross-referencing their names against the locations of the murders, detaining and questioning people who lacked the cognitive capacity to navigate an interrogation, and who were therefore precisely the kind of witnesses who would sign whatever was put in front of them. Burakov watched all of this. He filed more reports. He requested, again, the resources to pursue the transit hub theory, the undercover deployment on platforms, the systematic monitoring of middle-aged male commuters behaving unusually around children. The requests were denied. The telephone kept ringing. Nobody answered. On May 25, 1984, in a wooded area outside Shakhty, Andrei Chikatilo murdered 2 people, a mother and her daughter. The mother's name was Tatiana Petrosian. She was 32 years old. She had known Chikatilo since 1978, not well, not intimately, but through the mutual proximity of a small industrial town where people who moved in the same working-class circles were known to each other by name and association. She was not a stranger to him. This was unusual. He lured them both into the woods outside town. He attacked Tatiana first. Her daughter was 11 years old. Her name was Svetlana. She was standing close enough to see what was happening to her mother. When she understood, she ran. Chikatilo ran after her. He caught her. He killed her with a hammer. Svetlana Petrosian was 11 years old. She had watched her mother die, and she had run, and she had not been fast enough. The bodies were found together. 2 members of the same family, destroyed in the same afternoon, by the same man, in the same clearing. For Burakov, this case had a specific significance beyond the horror of its details. The personal connection between Chikatilo and Tatiana Petrosian, the fact that they had known each other, was a deviation from the pattern of stranger selection that had defined every previous murder. It suggested that the pressure building inside Chikatilo was reaching a level at which the careful, disciplined targeting of strangers was no longer always sufficient, that the need was outpacing the caution. On March 24, 1984, a 10-year-old boy named Dmitry Patashnikov left his home in Novoshakhtinsk to visit a stamp kiosk. He was an avid collector. This is one of those details that the record preserves and that resists being made into symbol. It is simply what he was, a 10-year-old boy who loved stamps, who had a collection he tended with the serious, specific care that children bring to the things they have decided matter. He went to the kiosk because there were new stamps he wanted to look at. Chikatilo was at the kiosk. He introduced himself as a fellow collector. He said he had rare stamps at home, more than he could display, stamps that a serious collector like Dmitry would appreciate seeing. He said it was not far. Dmitry went with him. His body was recovered 3 days later. What the forensic examination produced, beyond the evidence of the attack itself, was something the investigation had not had before: physical trace evidence with potential for identification. Semen and saliva samples, recovered from the boy's clothing, of sufficient quality to support serological testing. And there were witnesses. 2 people had seen Dmitry walking away from the stamp kiosk with a man. They described him: tall, thin, middle-aged, wearing thick glasses, carrying a briefcase. For the first time in 6 years of investigation, the killer had a physical description. The summer of 1984 was the most violent period of Chikatilo's killing career. Between June and September of that year, he murdered at least 9 people. The pace was unlike anything that had come before. He was moving faster, selecting targets with less caution, staying in the same geographic area rather than distributing his crimes across different jurisdictions. The academic literature on predatory behavior describes this as the acceleration phase, a period in which the internal compulsion has grown beyond the management capacity of the individual, in which the intervals between episodes shorten not from recklessness, but from necessity. He was in the grip of something he could no longer fully control. Among the dead that summer was Lyudmila Alexeyeva. She was 17 years old. She was a college student who had missed her bus connection in Rostov on the evening of August 7th. Chikatilo approached her under the pretext of helping her find the correct terminal. He directed her instead toward the banks of the Don River. The pathologist's report on Lyudmila Alexeyeva is one of the most difficult documents in this entire case to read. We will not describe it in full. What the record requires us to say is this: she was alive for a significant portion of what happened to her. The pathologist counted 39 separate wounds. Chikatilo had, in a gesture of deliberate desecration that the psychiatric evaluations would later classify as an expression of absolute dominance, placed her severed upper lip inside her mouth. She was 17 years old. She had missed her bus. Her older brother, who identified her body, would be in the courtroom 8 years later. We will return to him then. By September 1984, the investigation had reached a state of controlled desperation. Viktor Burakov had undercover officers deployed at train stations and bus terminals across the Rostov Oblast. The dragnet was not yet the full-scale operation it would become, but the infrastructure was being assembled. The card index system of suspicious individuals, the officer logs, the attempt to build a picture of the transit system's population of middle-aged men who behaved in ways that did not fit ordinary commuter patterns. The physical description from the Patashnikov witnesses was being circulated within the investigation. Tall, thin, middle-aged, thick glasses, briefcase. On September 13, 1984, an undercover officer at a Rostov bus station observed a man matching this description. The man was loitering. He was moving through the crowd with the specific lateral attention of someone who was not watching for a bus, who was watching people instead of transport schedules. He made contact with a young woman. The contact was of a nature that the officer recognized as the beginning of an approach. The officer followed him. A second officer moved in. They stopped the man. They asked for his documents. He handed them over. He was calm. He was cooperative. He said his name clearly and without hesitation. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. He was taken in for questioning. The search of his briefcase was conducted at the station. The officers opened it and found 3 things: a knife 20 centimeters long, a length of rope, a jar of Vaseline. They stared at these items. Then they looked at the man sitting across from them, quiet, cooperative, slightly awkward in the specific way of a middle-aged Soviet bureaucrat who has been inconvenienced by an administrative process he considers unnecessary. He said the knife was for his work. He said the rope was for tying packages. He said the Vaseline was for his skin in the cold. He said all of this calmly, with the patient reasonableness of a man who has nothing to hide and is simply waiting for the misunderstanding to resolve. The officers detained him. A full investigation began. His physical description was cross-referenced against the Patashnikov witness accounts. It matched. His name was checked against the address near the Grushevka River from the 1978 Zakotnova case. It was there, in the file, noted and unfollowed. His employment records were pulled. His movements during the relevant periods were reconstructed. He had been in the right places. He matched the physical description. He had been found with a knife, a rope, and Vaseline. And then the forensic laboratory returned its results on the biological samples recovered from the crime scenes. The semen evidence. The trace evidence that had been carefully collected from the bodies of his victims over 6 years of murders. The laboratory compared those samples to Andrei Chikatilo, and the results said he was not the man they were looking for. The science of this error is worth understanding, because understanding it is the only way to feel the full weight of what happened next. In 1984, the forensic standard for biological evidence in Soviet criminal investigations relied on ABO blood group typing, the same system used to classify blood donations, based on the presence or absence of specific antigens on the surface of red blood cells, and in most people, in their other bodily fluids as well. Most people. Approximately 80% of the human population. The other 20% are what the scientific literature calls non-secretors. Their blood type is encoded in their cells, as it is for everyone, but their bodily fluids, saliva, semen, sweat, do not contain detectable ABO antigens. The gene responsible for secreting those antigens into fluids, the FUT2 gene, exists in a non-functional form in non-secretors. Their blood says one thing. Their other biological traces say nothing at all. Andrei Chikatilo was a non-secretor. His blood type was type A. It had always been type A. A test of his blood produced a clear, unambiguous result, type A. The semen recovered from his victims, cross-contaminated in some cases, with the biological material of secretor victims whose own ABO antigens were present in the samples, tested as type AB. Type A does not equal type AB. In 1984, with the science available and the methodological framework in use, this was a biological exclusion. The forensic laboratory processed the comparison and arrived at the only conclusion its methodology allowed it to reach. This man's biology does not match the evidence from the crime scenes. He cannot be the killer. Andrei Chikatilo was held for 3 months. During those 3 months, the investigation reviewed everything it had: the knife, the rope, the Vaseline, the physical description matches, the location history, the prior notation in the 1978 file. All of it was weighed against the laboratory result. The laboratory result won, because that is what the methodology required, because the system had been built on the assumption that biological evidence was objective, that it did not lie, that it did not have blind spots, that when a laboratory produced a result, the correct response was to follow that result wherever it led. Where it led, in this case, was away from Andrei Chikatilo. In December 1984, after 3 months of detention, Chikatilo was released. The officers who had arrested him watched him collect his belongings from the custody desk. He picked up his briefcase. He walked through the door. He did not look back. The card with his name and details was filed in the archive. Not discarded, not destroyed, but filed, put away. Placed in a system that contained thousands of other cards with thousands of other names, in a room where cases went when the investigation had nowhere left to go with them. The door closed. Between December 1984 and November 1990, Andrei Chikatilo murdered 18 more people. Among them, a woman named Natalia Poklistova, who was mentally disabled and who was targeted for the specific vulnerability her condition represented. A woman named Irina Gulyayeva, also mentally disabled, whose naked body was left near a bus stop in daylight. An 11-year-old boy named Sasha Kravchenko, a name that carries its own terrible irony, given the man who had died carrying that surname, whose genitals were severed. A 10-year-old boy named Alyosha Khobotov, whose tongue was removed. Each of these murders happened after the door closed behind Chikatilo in December 1984. Each one was paid for, in part, by the methodology that had looked at type A blood and type AB semen and concluded, with the confident finality of a system that did not know what it did not know, that the man standing in front of it was innocent. The system was not malicious in this particular failure. It was simply operating at the edge of its own knowledge, reaching the boundary of what it knew how to see, and declaring, at that boundary, that there was nothing more to look at. That boundary killed people. Viktor Burakov knew, or strongly suspected, that a mistake had been made. He could not prove it. He could not override a laboratory result. He could not make the science say something it did not yet have the tools to say. What he could do was keep watching the platforms. He kept watching. There is a moment in every investigation like this one where the person doing the investigating has to decide whether to keep believing what the evidence is telling them or to follow the evidence even when it leads somewhere the evidence itself cannot yet explain. Burakov had a map full of red markers. He had a pattern that was as clear to him as anything he had seen in his professional life. He had a physical description that matched a man he had held in a room for 3 months. He had a knife and a rope and a jar of Vaseline. He had a name in a 1978 file and a name in a 1984 file, and the suspicion, which he could not prove and could not report and could not act on officially, that both files pointed at the same person. He kept that suspicion alive in the only way available to him. He maintained the surveillance, argued for the resources, and continued building the card index system that would eventually, 6 years later, provide the cross-reference that caught him. 6 years, 18 more dead. This is the cost of the boundary, not the malice of individuals, not the failure of any single officer or scientist or bureaucrat to do their job. The cost of a system operating at the edge of what it could see, unable to acknowledge that the edge existed, continuing forward as if the map were complete when the territory extended well beyond what the map could show. In Part 4, the investigation finds its missing instrument. Not a new piece of evidence, not a forensic breakthrough, not a confession or a witness or a body that finally provides the physical link the case has been missing for a decade. What changes the investigation is a piece of paper, 65 pages to be exact, written by a psychiatrist in Rostov who has never met the killer and is working only from crime scene photographs and the detailed, accumulated record of what was done and how. His name is Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, and what he writes, in the language of clinical psychiatry, in the careful, specific vocabulary of a man who has spent his career studying what the human mind is capable of, describes the person the investigation has been looking for with an accuracy that will, years later, make a guilty man weep in a cell and give up the only thing he has left, his silence.